The brass lamp felt cold and heavy in my hand, right before I used it to crack the intruder's skull. But that wasn't the most violent thing that happened in Jennifer's attic. I was standing in a pile of broken glass, clutching my late husband's journal, the one I thought was buried with him 3 years ago. I only had 20 minutes before Jennifer came home for her farewell dinner, and I had just read the first page. It said that while David was dying in hospice, crying out for me, my best friend told him I'd filed a restraining order to keep him away. She didn't just steal his last breaths, she made him die believing I hated him. My phone buzzed, a text from her saying, "See you in 10, babe." My tires were already slashed. I was trapped in the house of a woman who had been poisoning my husband for years while holding my hand at his funeral. Let me take you back to the moment I opened that suitcase. Dust motes danced in the singular shaft of light piercing the attic's grime, a shimmering curtain that separated Sarah Miller from the world below. Her knees crunched against grit as she hauled a vintage suitcase from the dark eaves. The leather handle flaked away like dead skin, leaving a rust-colored stain across her palms that smelled of old copper and decay. She fumbled with the brass latches. They resisted, swollen with decades of Pacific Northwest humidity, before snapping open with a metallic crack that echoed off the rafters like a gunshot. Sarah's breath hitched. Underneath a moth-eaten wool coat, the lining of the trunk bulged in a way that defied the natural slump of fabric. She traced a jagged tear in the silk, her fingers snagging on a hidden wooden slat that felt cold and unnervingly smooth. With a grunt of effort, she pried the false bottom upward. The scent of cedar and stagnant air rushed her senses, thick enough to taste. Inside lay a bundle of envelopes, cinched tight with a fraying rubber band that snapped the moment she touched it. Her own handwriting, the loopy S she used in college, the precise ink strokes of a woman pleading for a second chance, stared up at her from the yellowed paper. These were the letters she had sent to David during those final, agonizing months at the hospice. They had never touched a mailbox. They had never reached his bedside. They had been intercepted, stolen, and buried in the dark, while Jennifer Reed smiled and offered her tea downstairs. Beneath the paper trail lay a heavy weight of silver. Sarah lifted the object, the cold metal biting into her skin. David's engraved watch, the one Jennifer claimed a thief snatched during the graduation gala, shimmered in the gloom. The rhythmic ticking of her own pulse thrummed in her ears, a frantic counterpoint to the silence of the attic. Downstairs, the floorboards groaned. Jennifer's humming drifted up the stairwell, a melodic and sharp tune that made the hair on Sarah's neck bristle. It was a funeral dirge, low and mournful, the sound of a woman who had already buried the truth. Sarah shoved the bundle of letters into her waistband, the sharp edges of the paper scratching against her ribs as the attic door creaked open. "Sarah, are you still up there, honey?" Jennifer's voice was like honey poured over glass, sweet, but with a hidden edge that could draw blood. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She squeezed the stolen journal she had found beneath the watch, its leather cover worn thin by David's dying hands. She could feel the weight of a decade of deceit pressing down on her. Jennifer was moving to Chicago in less than 3 hours. The moving truck was already idling in the driveway, its engine a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the soles of Sarah's shoes. This was the last window of time to find the truth before it disappeared into the maw of a new city. The attic felt like a wooden ribcage, the sloped ceilings forcing Sarah into a permanent, submissive crouch. She heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the stairs. It wasn't Jennifer. It was Mike Davis, the local handyman who had been helping them clear out the heavy furniture. Mike was a man of few words, his hands calloused and stained with grease. but his eyes were always moving, always checking the exits. "Need a hand with that wardrobe, Sarah?" Mike asked, his voice a low rumble that cut through the oppressive silence. He stepped into the light, his back to the wall as he surveyed the cramped space. He noticed the open suitcase, the false bottom, and the look of sheer, cold fury on Sarah's face. "Mike," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "Look." She didn't need to explain. Mike saw the watch. He saw the letters. He had been a cop once, before the world broke him, and he knew a crime scene when he saw one. He moved to help her shift a heavy mahogany wardrobe that blocked the path to the window, his muscles straining against the wood. As he tilted the massive piece of furniture, the floorboards beneath it groaned and gave way. The sudden violence of the moment shattered the stillness. The attic window, thick with decades of grime, exploded inward. Glass shards rained down like diamonds, glittering in the single shaft of light. A figure masked in a dark woolen hood lunged through the opening. The intruder didn't hesitate. He swung a heavy lead pipe with a whistling sound that ended in a dull thud as it struck the side of the wardrobe Mike was holding. Sarah scrambled backward, her heels skidding on the dusty floor. The smell of the intruder hit her. Stale cigarettes and the metallic tang of old sweat. He lunged for her, his eyes wild and bloodshot behind the mask. He wasn't a professional. He was a scavenger, a local vagrant who had been casing the moving sale signs Jennifer had plastered all over the neighborhood. But desperation made him dangerous. He swung the pipe again, aiming for Sarah's head. She dove to the left, her hand closing around the base of a heavy brass lamp that sat atop a stack of crates. The metal was cold and pitted, but it had weight. As the intruder stepped forward, his boots crunching on the broken glass, Sarah swung with everything she had. The lamp connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening clack. He grunted, his knees buckling, and he stumbled back toward the open stairwell. The struggle was frantic and physical, the air filled with the sound of labored breathing and the rhythmic clicking of the cooling moving truck outside. Sarah didn't stop. She lunged forward, grabbing the bundle of letters and David's journal from the floor, clutching them to her chest like a shield. "Get out!" she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. Mike Davis was already moving. He dropped his end of the wardrobe, the wood hitting the floor with a bone-shaking crash, and tackled the intruder. They hit the floor in a tangle of limbs and coarse fabric. Mike's hands, the ones that could repair a delicate locket or rebuild an engine, were now clamped around the man's throat with terrifying efficiency. "Go, Sarah," Mike grunted, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cords. "Get to the car." Sarah didn't wait. She scrambled toward the exit, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She flew down the attic stairs, past the guest rooms filled with half-packed boxes, and into the narrow hallway of the second floor. She didn't look back. She could hear the muffled sounds of the struggle above her, the thud of a fist, the scrape of boots. But her only focus was the leather-bound book in her hand. She ducked into the small, windowless bathroom at the end of the hall and leaned against the door, the wood cool against her back. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The air here smelled of Jennifer's lavender soap and the sharp, chemical sting of bleach. Sarah's hands shook as she opened David's journal to the very last page. The handwriting was a jagged scrawl, the letters tilting and falling as if the writer were losing his grip on the world. October 14th, it began. The silence is the worst part. Jennifer says Sarah signed the papers, a restraining order. She says Sarah can't bear to see me like this, that she's already started the paperwork for the Chicago firm. I asked the nurse, but Jennifer was there. She always says the same thing. Sarah needs space, David. Let her go. I tried to call, but the phone is just static. Why won't she come? Why did she lock the door? The words blurred as Sarah's eyes filled with tears. A restraining order. Jennifer had lied to David on his deathbed, telling him his wife had abandoned him, while telling Sarah that David was too far gone to recognize her. She had built a wall of legal fiction and physical isolation, bearing the hospice door with a smile and a clipboard. Sarah's hazel eyes sharpened behind her glasses. She pushed them up the bridge of her nose, a reflex that usually signaled the start of a deposition. But there was no court here, only the rhythmic humming of Jennifer Reed, which had stopped. The house fell into a terrifying, vacuum-like silence. Sarah tucked the journal into the waistband of her jeans, next to the letters. She needed to get out. She needed her car. She needed to find Robert Thompson, her old mentor, the only man who knew how to dismantle a lie this deep. She crept out of the bathroom and down the main staircase. The foyer was a graveyard of cardboard boxes, each one labeled in Jennifer's neat, loopy script. Sarah made it to the front door, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle. She stepped out into the gray, oppressive afternoon of the Washington coast. The low-hanging clouds felt like a physical weight on her shoulders, pressing the damp moisture into her lungs. The driveway was long and exposed, a strip of black asphalt that offered no cover. She reached her car, a sensible silver sedan, and fumbled for her keys. She glanced at the moving truck. The driver was nowhere to be seen, likely grabbing a coffee or checking the straps. She shoved the key into the lock, but as she looked down, her heart plummeted. All 4 tires were flat. Not just flat, shredded. The rubber had been sliced with a clean, surgical precision, the gashes wide and mocking. Sarah pulled her phone from her pocket, her thumb hovering over the speed dial for Robert's office. She needed a ride. She needed a lawyer. She needed a way out of this grid of evergreen trees and polite lies. No service, the screen read. She stared at the bars, or the lack thereof. She had full bars 5 minutes ago. She looked up at the house. In the upstairs window, the one belonging to Jennifer's bedroom, a thin curtain fluttered. Sarah felt the world tilt. She wasn't just being delayed, she was being hunted. Jennifer wasn't just moving to Chicago. She was erasing the evidence of her life here, and Sarah was the last loose thread. The rhythmic clicking of the cooling car engine, tink, 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 sounded like a countdown. Sarah didn't panic. She couldn't afford to. She turned back toward the house, her posture rigid, her jaw set. If she couldn't leave, she would go deeper. She would find the rest of it. She slipped back inside, moving like a ghost through the labyrinth of boxes. She bypassed the kitchen and headed straight for Jennifer's bedroom. It was the only room in the house that didn't look packed. It was pristine, smelling of expensive perfumes and that same underlying scent of antiseptic that Jennifer seemed to carry everywhere. On the mahogany vanity, sitting next to a bottle of lavender oil, was a small velvet box. Sarah opened it. David's wedding ring. The gold band caught the dim light, the inscription on the inside, S and D forever, mocking her from the silk lining. Jennifer had told the entire funeral congregation that David had been buried with it. She had wept about how he wanted to take a piece of their friendship to the grave. "You're a thief, Jennifer," Sarah whispered, the words tasting like ash. She reached for the ring, but a shadow fell across the doorway. Sarah froze. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The smell of rain and wet wool preceded the man who stood there. "You shouldn't be in here, Sarah," a voice growled. It was Brian Reed, Jennifer's brother. He was a thick-necked man with a buzzed haircut and a permanent scowl. He stood in the doorway, cracking his knuckles in a specific, rhythmic order, pinky to thumb. He was wearing his heavy, steel-toed work boots, the leather polished to a mirror shine. "Where is she, Brian?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the hammer thud of her heart. "She's at the bistro, setting up the dinner. You know, for all the friends you haven't talked to in a year." Brian stepped into the room, his presence making the walls feel like they were closing in. "She told me you might get confused. Said the grief was finally catching up to you. I found the letters, Brian. I found the journal. I know she kept me out of the hospice." Brian didn't flinch. He just straightened his tie. Or rather, the place where a tie would be on his work shirt, exactly 3 times. It was a chilling, formal gesture. People hear what they want to hear, Sarah. And right now, everyone wants to hear that Jennifer is a saint, and you're the cold-hearted wife who stayed at the office while her husband died. Brian lunged. He was fast for a man his size, his hands reaching for the journal tucked into Sarah's waistband. Sarah didn't wait for him to close the distance. She swung her heavy leather briefcase, the one filled with legal briefs and the weight of her father's legacy, and caught him square in the chest. The impact made a dull oomph sound. Brian stumbled back, his boots scuffing the hardwood. Sarah didn't give him a second chance. She bolted past him, her shoulder clipping the doorframe as she sprinted toward the back stairs. She burst out the kitchen door and into the rainy driveway. The cold, penetrating dampness soaked through her blouse instantly. She ran toward the street, her lungs burning, her eyes searching the empty suburban road. A black car was idling at the end of the block. A rideshare she had summoned in a moment of frantic clarity before her service died. She waved her arms, her briefcase swinging wildly. The driver saw her and pulled forward, the tires splashing through a deep puddle. Sarah threw herself into the back seat just as Brian rounded the corner of the house, his face contorted in a mask of fury. He stopped at the edge of the lawn, the rain slicking his hair down. He didn't chase the car. He just stood there, watching, and straightened his non-existent tie 3 times. "Go," Sarah gasped to the driver. "Just drive. Anywhere with people. The bistro on 4th Street. The driver, a young man with headphones around his neck, nodded and pulled away. Sarah collapsed against the seat, the smell of cheap air freshener and old upholstery filling her nose. She reached into the back cover of David's journal, her fingers finding a hidden envelope she hadn't noticed before. She pulled out a stack of glossy photos. Her breath stopped. They were pictures of her. Sarah at a bar she'd never been to. Sarah laughing with a man she didn't recognize. Sarah entering a hotel room in Seattle on a Tuesday when she knew she had been in court. They were fakes. Crude but effective photoshops, her face grafted onto another woman's body. The lighting was slightly off, the shadows not quite matching the grain of the background. But to a dying man with failing eyesight, they would have been devastating. Jennifer hadn't just isolated David. She had murdered his memory of Sarah. She had shown him these photos while he lay in that sterile hospice bed, convincing him that while he was gasping for air, his wife was celebrating his absence in the arms of strangers. A buzz came from Sarah's pocket. Her phone had a single bar of service. A text message popped up from an unknown number. "The group chat loves the photos, Sarah. Everyone is so disappointed in you. Don't be late for dinner. We have so much to talk about." Sarah looked out the window at the passing grid of evergreen trees. The city of Portland was a relentless engine of movement. But here, in the damp silence of the suburbs, Jennifer Reed had constructed a perfect, airtight cage. Sarah pushed her glasses up her nose. She clicked her heavy metal pen 4 times, a rhythmic prayer for the family she couldn't save, and a promise for the one she would avenge. She wasn't going to the police. Not yet. She was going to that dinner. She was going to walk into that bistro, and she was going to tear the supportive friend mask off Jennifer Reed's face in front of every person who had ever doubted her. The bistro was a place of false comfort. Warm amber lighting, soft jazz, and the smell of expensive wine and roasted garlic. It was designed to make you feel safe. But as Sarah stepped through the door, the gold-rimmed mirrors on every wall reflected her own disheveled appearance. Her wet hair, her bloodshot eyes, the smudge of attic dust on her cheek. The restaurant was crowded. In the center of the room, a long table had been set for 12. Jennifer sat at the head, wearing an oversized muted cashmere sweater that made her look fragile and small. She was surrounded by their mutual friends. Richard Wilson, the golden boy, who was currently eating his asparagus in alphabetical order. Robert Thompson, who was staring at the ceiling tiles, and half a dozen others who had once been Sarah's world. As Sarah approached, the conversation died. It didn't just fade. It vanished, replaced by a cold, vacuum-like silence. Jennifer looked up, her wide eyes filling with tears instantly. "Sarah, oh, thank God. Brian told me you were having a hard time at the house. We were so worried." Richard Wilson looked at Sarah, his smile not reaching his eyes. "You okay, Sarah? You look a bit weathered, you know?" "I'm fine, Richard," Sarah said, her voice like a scalpel. She didn't sit down. She stood at the foot of the table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I found something in the attic, Jennifer. Something you must have forgotten." Jennifer reached out, her hand hovering near Sarah's forearm, an anchor connection that Sarah avoided by stepping back. "The attic? Oh, it's such a mess up there. I'm just such a disaster with details, honestly. Does that even make sense? It's all just a blur." "It makes perfect sense," Sarah said. She pulled the bundle of letters from her briefcase and dropped them onto the white tablecloth. They hit the wood with a dull, heavy thud. "These are the letters I wrote to David. The ones you told me he refused to read. The ones you told him I never sent." The table went still. Richard stopped chewing. Robert Thompson stopped counting tiles and looked down, his jaw clenched. Jennifer's face didn't change, but her eyes went flat. "Sarah, honey, you're confused. You've been working so hard. Maybe the grief is just making you see things that aren't there." "I see the wedding ring on your vanity, Jennifer," Sarah said, her voice rising, cutting through the soft jazz. "I see the photoshopped pictures you sent to David. I see the restraining order you forged to keep me out of the hospice." Jennifer stood up, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a scream. "How can you say that? After everything I did? I gave up a year of my life to sit by his bed because you were too busy with your important cases." "You didn't sit by his bed to comfort him," Sarah hissed. "You sat there to guard the door." Suddenly, the front door of the bistro opened. Mike Davis walked in, his heavy boots thudding on the polished floor. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood Elizabeth Carter, the nurse from the hospice. Elizabeth was a woman haunted by the silence she had kept, her hands scrubbing together in a phantom washing motion that never seemed to end. "Sarah," Mike said, his voice a low rumble, "we have a witness." Jennifer's breath hitched. For the first time, the mask slipped. Her face contorted, the soft features sharpening into something predatory. "She's lying. She's an old woman who was fired for incompetence. Sarah, you're making a scene. Please, for David's sake, just stop. For David's sake? Sarah laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. David died thinking I hated him because of you. Come with me, Jennifer whispered, her voice suddenly dropping to a low, dangerous register. Let's talk in the back, away from everyone. I'll explain. I'll tell you everything. Just don't do this here. Sarah hesitated. She looked at the faces of her friends, the doubt, the pity, the judgment. She needed a confession. She needed Jennifer to say it. Fine, Sarah said. She followed Jennifer into the back storage room, a narrow space filled with wine racks and extra linens. The door clicked shut behind them. Jennifer turned, her eyes wild, her hand dipping into the pocket of her oversized sweater. She pulled out a steak knife, the one she had palmed from the table when no one was looking. You should have stayed in the attic, Sarah, Jennifer hissed. The struggle was a blur of motion and the smell of stale wine. Jennifer lunged, the blade flashing in the dim light. Sarah blocked the first strike with her briefcase, the leather groaning under the impact. But Jennifer was fueled by a decade of repressed obsession. She swung again, the tip of the knife catching Sarah's palm. A sharp, hot sting erupted in Sarah's hand. Blood, bright and red, began to drip onto the floor. You think you won? Jennifer mocked, her voice a jagged edge. David signed everything over to me. The life insurance, the house, the accounts. He wanted to make sure I was taken care of, because I was the only one who stayed. You're broke, Sarah. You're a widow with nothing but a stack of old paper. Sarah backed away, her hand throbbing, her fingers slick with her own blood. He only signed those papers because he thought I was gone. And you are gone, Jennifer screamed. She dropped the knife suddenly, the metal clattering on the floor. Sarah froze. Why did she drop it? Jennifer began to scratch her own face, her nails digging deep furrows into her cheeks. She tore at her sweater, her eyes wide with a terrifying, calculated madness. Help! Jennifer screamed. She's killing me! Sarah, please stop! The door burst open. Richard, Robert, and the bistro manager rushed in. They saw Sarah standing there, bleeding, holding the knife she had just picked up from the floor in a reflex of self-defense. They saw Jennifer huddled in the corner, her face bleeding, her clothes torn, sobbing hysterically. Sarah, Robert Thompson whispered, the disappointment in his voice more painful than the knife wound. What have you done? Sarah looked at the knife in her hand. She looked at Jennifer, who was winking at her from behind her hands. The trap had closed. Sarah was no longer the grieving widow or the seeker of truth. In the eyes of everyone she knew, she was the monster. I didn't... Sarah started, but her voice was drowned out by the manager calling 911. She was restrained by the staff, her arms pinned behind her back. The cold metal of the handcuffs, when they eventually arrived, felt like a final, definitive period at the end of her life. Jennifer was led away by paramedics, playing the victim to the very last second, while Sarah was pushed toward the police cruiser. But Sarah Miller was a chronicler. She was a woman of documentation. As she sat in the back of the police station 2 hours later, her hand bandaged, her spirit frayed to a single thread, she looked at the officer across the desk. I have a recording, she said. She hadn't just been fighting in that storage room. She had reached into her pocket and hit record on her phone the moment the door closed. The officer sighed, a weary, rhythmic sound. Ma'am, we have 6 witnesses who saw you holding the knife. Listen to the audio, Sarah said, her voice steady. Bluetooth it to your speakers. Just listen. The officer hesitated, then shrugged. He connected the phone. The room was suddenly filled with Jennifer's voice, not the honeyed, breathy version, but the sharp, predatory hiss from the storage room. David signed everything over to me. I was the only one who stayed. You're broke, Sarah. I'm not locking you out. I'm taking stewardship. And then, the final, devastating reveal. He was so weak at the end, Sarah. It was so easy. Just a little bit of the medicine every day. Just enough to keep him quiet. Just enough to keep him needing me. The silence that followed the recording was absolute. The officer looked up, his face pale. The nurse, Elizabeth, who had been waiting in the hallway, began to scrub her hands so hard the skin turned raw. That's not just fraud, the officer whispered. That's a confession to murder. The resolution didn't come with a celebration. It came with a quiet, hollow realization. Jennifer Reed was arrested at the airport, her bags packed for Chicago, her supportive friend mask finally shattered by her own words. Months later, the Washington rain was a soft, rhythmic patter against the gray stones of the cemetery. Sarah Miller stood before David's headstone, her posture rigid, her hazel eyes clear. She pulled the intercepted letters from her coat, the ones that had spent a decade in a dark attic. She read them aloud, her voice steady and sure. She told him about the cases she had won, the house she had sold, and the way the light looked in the morning. She finished the conversation that had been interrupted by a monster. She touched the scar on her hand, a jagged white line that she no longer tried to hide. It was a symbol of survival. She turned away from the grave and walked toward her car. The sound of her own footsteps, a confident, rhythmic beat on the gravel path. The past was a closed book, documented and filed. The future was unwritten, and for the first time in years, Sarah Miller wasn't afraid of the silence. She drove away, leaving the wreckage of Jennifer's obsession in the rearview mirror, heading toward a city where the only truth that mattered was her own.